The calendar invite arrived at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning. No title. No agenda. No description in the body. Just a meeting time, 30 minutes, starting in 45, with Stuart's name as the organizer and 2 other internal names I didn't immediately recognize. That alone was unusual enough to notice. Stuart always put a subject in his meeting invites. He had done it for as long as I had worked under him. It was one of his minor professional habits, the kind so consistent you stop seeing it until the day it's missing. I got on the call at 9:30 exactly. Stuart was already there. His face was composed in the specific way that people compose themselves when they have rehearsed what they are about to say. Careful, even. Like someone reading from an internal script while trying to appear spontaneous. "Nora," he said, "thanks for jumping on. We're going to be making some changes to how your accounts are structured." He used the word restructuring. He used evolving business needs. He used long-term efficiency. Each phrase landed like something selected for how little information it actually contained. Then he said the real thing. "We've brought in someone more cost-effective to handle your accounts." Before I could form a single word in response, a new name appeared in the call participant list. My replacement had joined the meeting. In real time. While I was still on it. The call ended in under 10 minutes. Stuart wrapped it up with the practiced calm of someone who had done difficult conversations often enough to stop feeling them. He thanked me for my contributions. He mentioned transition support. He used the word smooth twice in the final 30 seconds, which told me he was more concerned about the process looking seamless than about anything I might be experiencing on the other side of the screen. Then, just before he ended the call, "This just makes better business sense, Nora." I said nothing. 20 minutes later, I received a message from a former colleague named Cassie, who still worked 2 floors above my team and had access to an internal leadership channel I was no longer part of. She had forwarded something without any accompanying note. No context. No apology. Just the forward. It was a message from Stuart to the senior leadership group. Sent 17 minutes after our call ended. Transition underway. Budget impact will be significant. Good news all around. Clients won't notice the difference. I read it twice. Then I typed my reply to Stuart's earlier summary email, a short, professional acknowledgement. Understood. I'll ensure a clean handover. No anger. No pushback. No lengthy response. Just 2 words that told him absolutely nothing about what I was actually thinking. My name is Nora. I had been in my role for 6 years. Not the loudest 6 years in the building. I was not the person who sent the most in the company newsletter or showed up first to the holiday party. I was the person who answered emails at 11 p.m. when something went wrong, who kept detailed records of every client preference and every agreed-upon exception, who remembered what each account needed before they had to ask. I was the fixer. Not the face, the foundation. The account that mattered most. The one Stuart had just handed to a stranger was one I had built from scratch. When it came to us 4 years ago, it was a single service contract worth a modest monthly retainer. I had grown it, carefully and consistently, into the company's 2nd largest active account. Not through aggressive tactics. Not through flashy pitches. Through trust. Through showing up. Through doing exactly what I said I would do, every single time, without exception. I had believed, genuinely and completely, that performance mattered more than politics. That results spoke louder than relationships with the right people upstairs. I had been wrong about that. But I had not yet been wrong about everything. The signs had started about 4 months before the call. Stuart had begun asking questions in our weekly check-ins that didn't quite fit the usual rhythm. Questions about account pricing structures. About the hours I logged against each client. About whether certain deliverables could be templated to reduce the time investment per cycle. I had answered honestly. I explained that some things that looked templatable weren't, because the value came precisely from the customization, from knowing each client well enough to know where the standard approach would fall short. Stuart had nodded along. At the time, I read his nods as understanding. The kind of understanding that comes from a manager who trusts their team members' expertise and adjusts expectations accordingly. I understand now that those nods meant something entirely different. He was not absorbing my reasoning. He was measuring the distance between what I was doing and what a cheaper version of the role might cover. He was drawing a line between where my contribution was genuinely irreplaceable and where it could be reduced to a process that someone else could follow. He was planning. I had taken the questions as routine interest. I had answered them fully, helpfully, without reservation. I had handed him the map he needed. The clearest early sign had come 3 months ago, and I had let myself dismiss it. A budgeting discussion had been scheduled internally, one directly tied to the accounts I managed. I had not been included in the invite. When I noticed and asked Stuart about it, he had been easy and quick with his response. "We've got it covered, Nora. It's more of a finance side thing. Nothing that affects your day-to-day." I had accepted that. I should not have accepted that. Because 3 months later, sitting with the full picture in front of me, I could see what that meeting had actually been. It was not a finance side conversation. It was the meeting where the decision about my replacement was first discussed. Where the cost-benefit of keeping me versus bringing in someone cheaper was laid out on a spreadsheet, and someone in a conference room had looked at the numbers and decided that the column on the right was more attractive than the one on the left. I had been excluded from the conversation about my own future, deliberately, so that by the time I was informed of the outcome, the decision would already be finalized and there would be no meaningful space left for my input or my objection. I had been removed before I even knew the process had started. His name was Brandon. I gathered this from the calendar invite, from the brief introduction Stuart had made before ending our call, and from the email signature that started appearing in threads I was being quietly copied out of. He started immediately. Within 48 hours of that Tuesday morning call, Brandon was sending communications to my accounts under the company's name, using a shared inbox I had been removed from. I knew because Cassie forwarded me one of the outgoing emails without comment. Just the forward, the way she had sent Stuart's message. I read it carefully. The email was clean enough on the surface, professional layout, correct company signature, the right general tone. But the language was templated in a way that anyone who had been receiving personalized communication for 4 years would notice immediately. The specific references that made each client feel seen and remembered were gone. The careful acknowledgement of past conversations, of ongoing nuances, of the particular vocabulary each account used internally, all of it missing. It read like a document produced by someone working from a brief they had been handed that morning, because that is exactly what it was. The account I had built over 4 years, layer by layer, conversation by conversation, was now being managed by someone reading from a summary they had received 48 hours ago. The relationship I had built with the client, a mid-size operations firm called Hargrove and Patton, was not something that appeared on any internal document. It was not in the contract. It was not in the SLA. It was not captured in any of the handover materials I had spent 3 careful days preparing before my access was formally closed. What the contract showed was a service arrangement, a scope of work, a pricing structure. What the contract did not show was 4 years of specific trust, the kind built in the margins of formal agreements. It was built in the phone call I had taken at 9 p.m. on a Friday when their internal system failed before a board presentation. It was built in the time I had flagged a potential issue in their quarterly report before they had noticed it themselves, which saved them a conversation they would have dreaded. It was built in the fact that I remembered the name of the operations director's assistant, and the assistant remembered mine, and that small human detail mattered more in a long-term client relationship than most account managers are trained to believe. The client, specifically the operations director, Mr. Whitfield, had not worked with the company. He had worked with me. Those are not the same thing. And Stuart had confused them. The email arrived 10 days after the transition. It went to the company's general account management inbox, which Brandon now monitored, but it was also forwarded to a wider internal distribution by someone in client services who thought it needed visibility. Cassie made sure I saw it. Mr. Whitfield had written it in his usual style, measured, direct, polite in a way that made the concern more pointed rather than less. "We've noticed some changes to how our account is being managed. The last 2 communications referenced items we'd previously discussed and moved on from, and a standing preference we'd flagged several months ago doesn't appear to be reflected in the current approach. Can someone clarify what's changed on your end?" It was not an angry email, which made it more serious, not less. Angry emails can be managed with apologies and corrections. An email like this one, calm, specific, asking a clear question, was written by someone who had already begun forming a conclusion and was giving the company a formal opportunity to change it before that conclusion became final. Brandon's reply arrived 2 hours later. I did not see it directly. Cassie described it to me in a short message. He apologized and said the team was still getting up to speed. That's all. The cracks were already forming. I did nothing publicly. I want to be clear about that. Not because the impulse to do otherwise was absent, but because I understood, clearly and early, that the most damaging thing I could do to my own position was to act from emotion. I had been replaced by someone cheaper. My years of work had been reduced to a line on a cost-benefit spreadsheet. A client I had built from a single contract to the company's second-largest account was now receiving templated emails from someone who had been in the role for 10 days. I felt all of that, and I said nothing. What I did instead was organize. I spent 4 evenings going through my personal records, the files I had kept on my own drives, the emails I had saved to personal folders, the notes I had made over 6 years of client interactions. I built a clear and thorough document of my contributions, timelines, outcomes, account growth figures, specific instances where my involvement had produced measurable results. I was not preparing a complaint. I was preparing a picture, one that could be presented clearly and factually if and when the right moment arrived. And I was beginning to understand that the right moment was not as far away as Stuart assumed it was. There was something Stuart had not known. When I left, I did not sever every line of communication that existed between me and the accounts I had managed. I could not. Those relationships had been built personally, and personal relationships do not reset simply because an internal org chart changes. Mr. Whitfield had my direct contact, my personal email, my phone number. He had used both before, not frequently, but at the moments that mattered. The times when something was urgent and he needed a direct answer, not a ticketing system or a managed inbox. I had not reached out to him after the transition. I had not engineered any continued communication. I had kept my distance cleanly and professionally, because I understood that crossing that line without cause would compromise my credibility. But that line of communication existed, and it had not been closed on his end. I knew that. I also knew Mr. Whitfield well enough to know what would make him use it. He would use it when the formal channel failed him clearly enough that he needed to understand what was actually happening. Not for minor friction. He was too professional for that. But for something that made him feel that the relationship he had invested in was being disrespected in a way he hadn't been given the chance to address. That moment was coming. The only question was when. 3 weeks after the transition, Stuart sent a message to the senior leadership group celebrating early results. Cassie forwarded it. Cost restructuring on key accounts is tracking well. Budget efficiency up 23% in the first month. Transition has been smooth, no major client feedback. Strong early indicator that this model is scalable. He had sent it on a Thursday morning, apparently feeling confident enough to share a victory. 23% budget efficiency. That was the number he was proud of. He was not wrong that the costs had gone down. Brandon earned less than I had. The math was accurate. And from inside a spreadsheet, with the right columns highlighted, the picture looked clean and simple. What the spreadsheet did not show was what was happening on the other side of the relationship. The questions Mr. Whitfield's team was now asking that were going unanswered well. The small miscommunications accumulating in the account's working record. The gradual, quiet shift in how Hargrove and Patton was engaging with incoming communications, shorter replies, longer response times, a tone that had moved from warm and collaborative to polite and transactional. Stuart had stopped paying attention once the numbers looked good. That was the mistake. When you stop paying attention, you lose the ability to see the thing coming before it arrives. The message came on a Wednesday evening. I had just finished dinner and was reading through some documentation when my phone showed a notification. A message to my personal email from an address I recognized immediately. Mr. Whitfield. Nora, I hope this finds you well. I wanted to reach out directly. Something feels off with how things are being handled on our account. I wasn't sure if you were still involved in any capacity. Are you? I read it 3 times. Not because it was complicated. The message was clear and direct, the way Mr. Whitfield always was. I read it 3 times because I wanted to be certain of what it was and wasn't before I responded to it. It was not a complaint. It was not an invitation to criticize the company. It was a man who had built trust with a specific person over 4 years, who had sensed that something had changed, and who was reaching out through the only channel he had that he trusted to give him an honest answer. He wasn't asking me to fix anything. He was asking if I was still there. The answer was complicated, and the way I responded to it would matter more than almost anything I had done in the previous 3 weeks. I put my phone down and thought about it carefully before I typed a single word. I waited until the following morning to respond. Not because I didn't know what to say. I had worked out the shape of my reply within an hour of reading his message. I waited because I wanted to write it without any trace of the emotions that had been present the night before. When someone is reading carefully, they can tell the difference between a message written from a clear head and one written from a wound that hasn't healed yet. My reply was short. Mr. Whitfield, thank you for reaching out. I'm no longer managing the account directly, but I'm always happy to provide context on past work or help clarify anything from our time together if that would be useful. I hope the transition has gone smoothly on your end. I read it 4 times before I sent it. It contained no criticism, no implication, no invitation to complain about the company or the person who had replaced me. What it did contain was the most important thing I could offer at that moment: presence. A calm, professional, non-dramatic signal that I was still reachable, still the same person he had trusted for 4 years, and still someone who would handle his concerns with the same care I always had. He read between the lines. I knew he would. It was time to be honest with myself about where I actually stood. Not emotionally, practically. I had spent enough time in the previous weeks processing what had happened. Now I needed to see the full picture clearly, and without the distortion that comes from either panic or bitterness. My financial position was better than it might have been. 18 months before the call, I had gone through a period of reassessing my savings, not because I had predicted this situation, but because I had reached the age and stage of career where building a cushion felt like the responsible thing to do. I had 5 months of living expenses set aside, fully accessible. My professional record was documented, not as a grievance, but as a factual account of 6 years of specific, traceable contributions, account growth, client retention, revenue figures tied to decisions I had made, and initiatives I had led. My relationships were intact. Not just Mr. Whitfield. Across the industry, I had maintained connections carefully over the years. 2 of them had reached out in the past week after hearing, through the professional network, that I had left. And there was an option on the table. A smaller consulting firm had been in conversation with me, informally, over the previous month, about a client relationship role. The conversations had been exploratory. I had not pushed them forward. But they were real, and they were still open. I was not stuck. I was positioned. Brandon's mistakes started stacking visibly in week 5. The first was a deliverable sent to Hargrove and Patton that used the wrong quarterly figures, numbers from the previous year's cycle, not the current one. It was a small error in isolation, but it was the kind of error that signals something larger. That the person producing the work is not fully inside the account. That they are working from templates and summaries rather than from genuine, embedded knowledge. Mr. Whitfield's team flagged it. The correction was made, with an apology. The second error was more serious. A scope clarification that Hargrove and Patton had formally requested, something that required understanding a specific ongoing negotiation between their internal teams, was answered with a generic response that made clear Brandon had not read the background. The response also committed the company to a deliverable timeline that conflicted with something already agreed upon in writing 4 months earlier. His response to the follow-up, according to what Cassie could see in the shared thread, was to ask for more context, a phrase that reads, to a client who has already provided that context twice, as a signal that no one is tracking the account properly. Frustration was building on Hargrove and Patton's side. Quietly, professionally, but building. The formal pushback came at the end of week 6. Mr. Whitfield sent an email to the company's senior accounts address, a level above Brandon, a level above Stewart's direct team. He copied 3 people from his own organization, which signaled that this was no longer an individual concern but one being communicated with institutional weight. The email was 2 paragraphs. Professional, measured, specific. We want to flag that the quality and consistency of service we've received over the past 6 weeks has not met the standard we've come to expect. We've experienced several instances of incorrect information, missed context, and delayed resolution. We'd like to request a formal review of how our account is being managed before we make any decisions about our contract renewal, which is scheduled for next quarter. Stewart held an internal call that same afternoon. I was not on it, but Cassie attended in a note-taking capacity, and she described the tone afterward in a message that arrived late that evening. Stewart had described the email as not ideal but manageable. He said the relationship was solid, and that the right response and a few direct conversations would bring things back on track. He was still operating from the assumption that the client was invested in the company's institutional relationship. He had not yet understood what the client was actually invested in. The week that followed Stuart's internal call was not a recovery. It was a slow unraveling. Pressure from above, from the directors who had received Mr. Whitfield's escalation email, began filtering down into Stuart's day. He held 2 additional internal meetings that I was not part of, both described to me secondhand as increasingly tense in tone. He began directing the blame toward Brandon. Brandon, in return, pointed to what he described as unclear process documentation in the handover materials. He said the account's historical context had not been fully captured. He said there were agreements and preferences that had never been formally recorded. He was not entirely wrong about that. But no one in those rooms acknowledged the obvious reason. That some of what made that account run well could not be documented, because it lived inside a relationship. It was not a process failure. It was the predictable consequence of replacing a person with a procedure. Stuart could not say that out loud because saying it would have meant acknowledging that the cost-saving decision had been wrong. And acknowledging that the decision was wrong meant accepting responsibility for what it was costing. So instead, the rooms filled with deflection. The real cause sat quietly outside those conversations, unacknowledged, while the people inside them argued about documentation gaps. Mr. Whitfield sent a second email at the end of week 7. This one was addressed differently, to senior leadership, to the client services director, and to 3 members of his own executive team. The distribution list alone was a signal of how far the situation had traveled. The content was measured and devastating in the way that only carefully written disappointment can be. We want to be transparent about where we are. Since the account management change, we have experienced consistent gaps in service quality that have impacted our internal operations on 3 separate occasions. We have raised these concerns through the appropriate channels and have not seen the level of resolution that gives us confidence in the current arrangement. We are beginning an internal review of our service relationships and want to give your team visibility into that process. He was not threatening to leave in that email. He was informing them that he was building the case to leave. There is a difference, and anyone who has managed a senior client relationship for longer than 2 years understands it immediately. The threatening email is an invitation to negotiate. The informing email is a courtesy before a decision already forming. I read it when Cassie forwarded it. I saved it to my documentation folder. The final mistake happened in week 8. Hargrove and Patton had a standing quarterly review, a structured session that I had developed the format for 3 years earlier and had run personally every single cycle since. It required advanced preparation, specific framing, and a clear understanding of what each side needed to take away from the conversation. Brandon ran it. I pieced together what happened from 2 sources. A brief message from Cassie and a professional summary that Mr. Whitfield's assistant forwarded to me through my personal email without explanation or commentary. Brandon had prepared the wrong version of the performance report. He had pulled data from a different service line, one that Hargrove and Patton did not use, and had presented it as their account summary for the quarter. Mr. Whitfield had stopped him 12 minutes into the presentation. He had asked, in front of his own team, whether Brandon had reviewed the correct account documentation before joining the call. Brandon had said he would follow up with corrections. Mr. Whitfield had thanked him for his time and ended the session early. He had not raised his voice. He had not made it a scene. He had simply closed the call the way a person closes something they are finished with. There was nothing to recover from after that. The notice arrived in writing, formal and final. Hargrove and Patton notified the company that they were pausing all active work immediately, pending an internal service review. The pause language was standard, the kind used when a client wants to exit cleanly without triggering contractual complications ahead of their exit. 2 weeks later, the formal termination of the contract was submitted. The company's second largest active account was gone. I heard the number that represented that contract's annual value from Cassie, who had been in the room when it was discussed at a senior level. It was a number that would land heavily on any quarterly report. The kind of number that prompts questions from above about what happened and who is responsible. Stuart held an emergency meeting, then another one, then a third. The cost-saving decision, the one he had celebrated internally as a 23% budget efficiency gain, had now produced a revenue loss that erased not just that gain, but significantly more. The math, when recalculated with the correct inputs, no longer looked clean. He had saved money on salary, He had lost an account that was worth multiples of that saving every single year. The business case he had presented to leadership 3 months ago had rested on one assumption: that the client would not notice the difference. The client had noticed everything. The internal shift happened quickly once the loss became official. People who had been careful about what they said around the situation, who had nodded along when Stuart framed the transition as progress, began saying different things in smaller, quieter conversations. Cassie was not the only one sending me messages now. 2 members of the client services team reached out separately. One told me that the handover review had turned up a list of account preferences and historical notes that Brandon had never been shown. Details that should have been part of the formal transition but had been rushed through in under 3 days because Stuart had wanted the cost savings to begin immediately. Another told me that the quarterly review disaster had spread internally faster than Stuart had managed to contain it. That people were talking. That the connection between the account loss and the specific decision that preceded it was not a secret anymore. A senior colleague I had respected for years sent a short message that said simply, "Everyone knew the relationship was yours. I'm sorry it took this to make that obvious." It was not satisfaction I felt reading these messages. It was something quieter and more complicated. The recognition that the truth had been visible all along, and that what it sometimes takes for the obvious to become sayable is a failure large enough that silence is no longer the safer option. The formal review was initiated by the client services director, a position senior to Stuart, approximately 3 weeks after the contract termination. I was contacted by someone from that office and asked to participate voluntarily. I agreed. I submitted my documentation folder, organized, factual, and thorough, through a formal channel. What the review examined was not just the account loss. It examined the decision-making process that had preceded it, the speed of the transition, the adequacy of the handover, the internal communications that had characterized the process, including Stuart's message celebrating the cost savings and his description of a smooth transition in the same week that Mr. Whitfield's first formal concern arrived. The timeline was damaging when laid out clearly. Stuart's narrative, that this had been a sound strategic decision undone by a replacement who had underperformed, did not survive contact with the documented sequence of events. The review found that the decision had been made without adequate assessment of relationship risk, that the transition had been rushed in a way that prioritized budget timelines over operational continuity, that early warning signals from the client had been downplayed rather than escalated. The consequences were determined through internal process. But the review had done what documentation always does when it is thorough and honest. It had made the truth impossible to argue with. 8 months after that Tuesday morning call, my professional life looked nothing like the one I had been living before it. I had joined the consulting firm that had been in conversation with me during those final difficult weeks. The move had happened quickly once I had made the decision. They had been patient with the timing and clear about what they were offering. A senior client relationship role, smaller team, genuine autonomy, and work that was explicitly tied to my name in every deliverable. The adjustment had taken about 6 weeks. New systems, new colleagues, a different pace and vocabulary. I had made a point of listening more than I spoke in the first month, which is something I had learned the value of over 6 years of client-facing work. By month 3, I had restructured 2 of the firm's existing client relationships in ways that produced measurable improvements in both retention and satisfaction scores. By month 6, one of those clients had expanded their engagement significantly. My name was attached to those outcomes in the internal record, clearly, accurately, and without negotiation. 2 former colleagues from my previous company reached out during that period asking about opportunities. I connected them where I could. I did not speak critically of where they had come from. There was no version of the story that required me to tear something down. What I had built was enough. Brandon left the company 4 months after the contract termination. I heard this through the same professional network that had been passing information in both directions since the transition. He had not been fired. His departure was framed, from what I could gather, as mutual. He moved to a role at a smaller firm in a different sector. I have no particular feeling about Brandon. He had not engineered what happened to me. He had accepted a role he was given, done the work he knew how to do, and been placed in a situation that was structurally set up to fail before he arrived. The account's loss was not his fault. It was the fault of the decision that preceded him. Stuart's situation took longer to resolve, but it resolved. His scope of responsibility was reduced significantly in the quarter following the review. 2 accounts that had reported to his team were moved under different management. His name appeared less frequently in leadership communications. The trajectory that had looked, a year earlier, like a continued rise had shifted, quietly, permanently, into something much flatter. The confidence that had produced that message, "Clients won't notice the difference," was gone. What had replaced it, from every account I heard, was a kind of careful, chastened smallness. The particular diminishment that arrives when a person has been proven wrong in a way that cannot be reframed or redirected or explained away. It was not the dramatic reckoning I had imagined on my worst evenings. It was simply reality, arriving on its own schedule. I thought about that phrase sometimes. "This just makes better business sense." Stewart had said it at the end of a call. He had said it the way people say things they have decided are true before they have finished testing whether they are. It had not made better business sense. The math, properly completed, ran entirely the other way. The salary they had saved on my replacement was a fraction of the annual contract value they had lost. The budget efficiency Stewart had celebrated at 23% had produced a revenue impact that would take years to fully absorb. The decision that had looked clean and smart on a cost spreadsheet had cost the company more than any version of keeping me would have. But numbers were not really the point. The point was something simpler and harder to quantify. They had believed that my role was a salary, a line item, something that could be swapped for a cheaper version without the output changing in any meaningful way. They had not understood that my role was a relationship. And relationships are not transferable. They are not documented in handover materials. They cannot be replicated by someone working from a 3-day briefing. They live in years of small, consistent, human moments that accumulate into trust. You can replace a salary. You cannot replace trust. That is not a sentiment. It is a business fact. And it was proven, with full documentation, in 8 weeks.